Okay, so on to the panelists. Our first panelist is Dr. Nalini Nadkarni. Nalini, as you probably know, is a professor of biology at the University of Utah, a canopy ecologist, and as I said, the person responsible for a wide variety of really innovative and successful BI activities over the years. And did I also mention she was on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me? I don't know if I mentioned that, but it's so cool. Our second panelist is the Reverend Dr. Amy Laura Hall. Amy Laura is an associate professor of Christian ethics in Duke University's Divinity School. She served on the steering committee of the Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy Center and has taught a number of courses at the interface of science and faith, such as medical ethics and bioethics and reproduction. And our final panelist is Dr. Andrew Aghapour. Andrew has a master's in history and philosophy of science from Cambridge University and a PhD in religious studies from UNC Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. He is currently working as a consulting scholar on religion and science for the Smithsonian and also works as a journalist, stand-up comedian, and improv performer. I'm really excited about this conversation. And I'd like to ask you, Nalini, to get started by telling us a bit more about yourself and your work reaching out to communities of faith.
Sure. Thanks very much, Jory and Susan. As you said, I identify myself primarily as a forest ecologist, studying ecological interactions of plants and animals in the forest canopy. I'm working mainly in Costa Rica and Washington State, and with a growing awareness of the negative impacts of human activities on rainforests, I felt like as a scientist and as a person, I could raise awareness about this by doing more work in public engagement. And I decided I would focus on those public groups that maybe have never visited or might never visit a tropical rainforest, might not bring their kids to a museum, might not read a natural history magazine or watch a nature documentary. And so trying to reach those public groups that either do not or cannot gain access to science education through traditional means. I feel like my overall approach, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about my work with faith-based groups in just a minute, Jory, but just to share with you my general approach, I really feel that it's important to recognize that non-scientists might hold other values and beliefs that are valid, but different from my own. And so I seek to find common ground between those who may not share my values. I may not share their values, but that we can find common ground. For example, trees are important to humans, and then sort of work on conversations, work on common activities, and build a sense of connection and engagement with those public groups. I'm done.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were gonna share your screen, but I guess you're gonna do that in a few minutes.
Yes, right.
Great, okay, great. So next up, Amy Laura, would you tell us a little bit about your work at the interface of science and faith and how you got involved in this work, coming from background in theology?
So my PhD, which I graduated from Yale in 1999 and came straight to Duke to start teaching at Duke. And so I've been on faculty now for 21 years, is that right? 22, whatever, do the math. And I do a lot of teaching using fiction. I use film, I use movies, I use novels. The novel I brought with me, Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler. I use a lot of speculative fiction, and I teach across different parts of Duke. So I'm anchored in the Divinity School, but I try not to let that pull me down. I try to teach in other parts of the university. So I also teach in graduate liberal studies. I also teach in science and society. When you invite me, I teach in the focus program at Duke, in global health currently. And I also have taught the genomics focus program, which is a program for first semester, first year Duke undergraduates. And I should maybe say something about my own home decor here. I have been in Texas since March 6th because I came to help take care of my parents during spring break. And then I've been hunkered down with mom and dad since. So this is my father's office, not mine. And I'll end there and look forward to the conversation.
Amy Laura, are you in that picture over your shoulder there? Is that
Yeah,
one of your childhood
yeah,
pictures?
I thought about removing that.
It's awesome.
It's so cheesy. Maybe I should leave it. Yeah, and these are my grandparents. It's my dad's parents looking over my shoulder here.
As they should be, a fine-looking couple. Great, thank you. Thanks very much. Okay, Andrew, can you please tell us a little bit about your background, your interests in the interface of religion and science?
Yeah, thank you, Jory, and thanks to the organizers of this conference and for everybody who's attending. And it's such a pleasure to be with these two co-panelists. Thank you, Drs. Nadkarni and Hall. My background is that I am a scholar of religion, and I study the history and interrelations of religion and science. So my intellectual background is that I went to Cambridge to do an MPhil in the history and philosophy of science. I was interested in how religion had interacted with science over the course of modernity and in the present. And that wasn't really being done there, which is why I came to North Carolina to Chapel Hill to do religious studies. I'm really interested in the ways that religion and science have interacted over the course of since the Enlightenment or throughout history, and in how that can help us today to better understand some of the dynamics of this complicated world that we live in. One of the things that maybe we can talk about a little bit that might be interesting today is the fact that so many of us, probably many of those of you tuning in, assume that religion and science are in conflict, that they are pitted against each other, and that somehow if you're religious, you're not going to appreciate science, and that if you're a scientist, you have a really specific type of worldview. And that overlooks just how diverse and various both science and religion are. And so it's really exciting to I look forward to this conversation to explore some of these weird intersections. I also am at the Smithsonian developing an exhibit on religion and science in American history. And I'm a comedian, and my one-person show is about being a agnostic scientific person raised by a Muslim father and a Christian mother. So I'm really interested in all the ways that things get matched together, and it's exciting to be here.
Great. Well, thank you all for those introductions. And I'm just going to jump right in. Actually, I want to do one more reminder. If you have questions for any of our panelists, muresearcheris@missouri.edu. Send that email. Sarah will forward the questions on to me. So I'd like to start with you, Nalini. Could you to tell us a bit more about your work, the work you've been doing to bridge the science and faith communities through science outreach?
Sure. I'm really happy to provide my experiences working with faith-based groups. And I'll just share my screen here. I put together a few slides. So the common thread of the work that I've done over the last 15 or 20 years has really been to, even though I'm a scientist, I want to use religious authorities and I want to present in religious venues. But at the same time, I want to maintain my own identity as a scientist and as a person of my own religious background. My dad actually was raised as a Hindu. Andrew, you'll appreciate this. My mother as an Orthodox Jew. As an adult, I attend Quaker meetings. So I have this kind of odd mixture that maybe, like you, prepares me to link together communities of faith with scientists. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to sort of encapsulate a sequence of activities and events that I've attempted over the years, taking me from just a pure scientist to a science communicator, from starting with one faith and moving to multiple faiths, and starting at a very, very small scale 15 years ago, just with a single church, and then moving up to larger scales as I've worked through some of these. And I think that the way we can sort of set this into context is that many of us are trying to answer this question: how do we understand and communicate in a world that is experiencing increasing disturbance? And there are many different approaches to this. There's intuition, there are traditional and indigenous approaches, aesthetic approaches, religious approaches, and of course, scientific approaches. And I think that all of these have validity, and all of them, or some of them, might be woven together to actually get better at answering this very question. And so starting myself, as I mentioned earlier, as a scientist who studies the forest canopy, been doing this for 40 years in Costa Rica and Washington State. As a tropical biologist, as a biologist and ecologist, it's really impossible to be unaware of the fact that many rainforests are undergoing a lot of problems due to human activities. And this is sort of going on at the same time that many people are suffering from isolation and being cut off from nature and from the scientific way of knowing. And so I felt that what I could do would be to try to connect scientists, especially forest ecologists, to the general public. I started out in early years, we started at the International Canopy Network, a nonprofit. We published articles in natural history magazines. We consulted to National Geographic, but we pretty soon realized that we were basically, sort of preaching to the choir, communicating with people who already understand the importance of trees and forests. And I felt it might be important to explore ways that we could reach, like a little girl who grows up in New York City who didn't get to climb trees as I did when I was a little kid. So the students in my lab and I created Treetop Barbie in 2004. To our delight, although it was rejected at first by Mattel, just this last year, they've started their own line in conjunction with National Geographic with Explorer Barbies. And so this is sort of just an example of how a single scientist can start very small, and potentially this can evolve into something that's larger scale, which is, I think, echoed in the work that I've been able to do with faith-based communities. Another group that is really deeply scientifically underserved and very much in a nature deficit situation are those who are incarcerated. And so some of the work that I've done has been to involve scientists with giving science lectures, linking with conservation groups to provide training for inmates in state prisons and county jails and juvenile detention centers with the opportunities to hear science lectures and also participate in conservation efforts. And I'll pick up a little bit on this at the very end when we talk about topics that relate to religion as well as science. But what I'd like to share with you most is how I've attempted, and my colleagues and I have attempted to link the spiritual and religious values of trees with the ecological values of trees and forests, and to how we might put those together and present them to religious communities in ways that are not in conflict, but rather in concert, as Andrew mentioned. And even though I was raised as a Hindu Jew, I mean, even I was aware of the fact that trees are religious symbols in many, many world religions. In the first page of the Bible, we read about the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so I decided that it might be a good approach, rather than shoving scientific evidence based on scientific authorities down the throats of religious people, but rather for myself as a scientist to read the religious scriptures of the world religions, find out how they portray and describe the values of trees and forests, and then present that to people of faith-based communities. So I read and downloaded the Bible, the Talmud, the Quran, the Book of Mormon, and I searched for all of the verses that had the word tree and forest in them. I found in the Old Testament, for example, there were 328 references to those two words, trees and forests. And of course, being a scientist, I had to do a histogram to sort of categorize these as symbolic and aesthetic use, analogies to life and God, practical use, location descriptions, tree loss is bad, and then there were a few references to tree biology. So for example, I could say in terms of trees as being used as adornment for temples, I could draw upon some lines from Genesis on the walls of all around the temple in both inner and outer rooms, the cherubim palm trees and the open flowers. We could look at practical use, that God gave us every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. Trees were used as location markers, which was very important in terms of sort of the values of people who were reading the Bible or living in those times. I also recognize that this is true not only in the Christian tradition, but that trees are valued in other world religions. Those of the Jewish faith celebrate this fabulous holiday called Tu B'Shavat, which is the New Year for trees, in which there's this particular Seder or ceremonial dinner where the fruits and seeds and nuts and spices of trees that are really a gift to human beings are presented and celebrated by Jews all around the world. In the Book of Mormon, which is important to me because I live in Utah, we learn about a tree with white fruits, which really is another representation of the tree of life. In the Islamic religion, the word Allah is a very important word, and it's written in Arabic, as you can see here on the screen. And many people in the Islamic faith look for that word, looks for that symbol of Allah, and many see them in the branch arrangements of trees. And so that's another sort of celebration and documentation of the value of trees symbolically in the life of those of the Islamic faith. In Eastern religions, of course, we know that Buddha engaged with enlightenment under the shade of the Bodhi tree. And in India, the country of my father, sacred groves were set aside centuries and centuries ago to preserve the spaces where they believed that deities lived. And now, including today, those sacred groves are really the repositories of tree biodiversity in that very crowded country. So you can see in all of these faiths around the world, trees and forests are considered sacred, important, fundamental to humans who are part of that faith. So drawing upon that information that I gleaned from these religious authorities, I thought it would be a good idea to present what I had learned to people of faith in the venues where they normally go themselves, that is their churches, their synagogues, their temples. But not having myself gone to church when I was a little kid, I really needed to learn what it was like to be in, what is it like to be in a place, in a venue of religious faith. And so I spent a few months just going to different churches, sitting in the back pews and taking in what I could learn from what I called immersion visits, of immersing myself as an individual who doesn't know about faith-based groups and to try to learn as much as I could about what goes on there. So for example, I learned that sermons are only 20 minutes long. Like I'm used to giving lectures that are 50 minutes long, but I realized if I'm to give a sermon, then it has to be much shorter. The people who attend wear good clothes, they're respectful, they're quiet, they're listening, they're very respectful to what comes across during the sermon. There's a collection plate that goes around in a sort of collecting an offering from those who participate. These sermons are often very emotional, and there's often emotional responses to them, not something I experience in my Biology 101 class. There are sacred places within places of worship. There are sacred objects that require respect. There's often music associated with religious groups, so choirs and informal singing of hymns. And I think what I learned that was most important, and Andrew, maybe this goes to your point in your introduction, is that people were really friendly to me. Even though I wasn't a Baptist or a Protestant or a Christian even coming into their churches, after the coffee, at the coffee hour after the service, I was greeted by people. They shook my hand, they welcomed me. I heard conversations about vacations and pets. And I realized then that churches are not unaccepting to people outside of their faith, but in fact, there's a place for someone who's outside their faith inside their venues. And so I put together a sermon called Trees and Spirituality, in which I pulled together the information I just described to you. I started with Unitarians. They turned out to be the most open to somebody coming from outside to take their pulpit. But then I went on to being passed around to Presbyterians, Catholics, Episcopalians, Jews in synagogues, Buddhists in temples. And so I've given this seminar probably in about 40 different places of worship in various cities. That was one approach to spreading what I learned about faith-based groups with respect to trees and forests. But my students and I took another approach later on during the sequence, in which we mapped the trees and the churchyards of churches. I figured that since churches and churchyards are sacred ground, probably the trees that grow in those churchyards are also sacred because they're growing on sacred ground and would be accepted by the congregants as being sacred as well. So we made these little pamphlets. This one that I show you here is for the Episcopal Cathedral in Salt Lake City. It's a 12-page pamphlet that illustrates the different species of trees that grow in those churchyards with biological references to that species of tree, as well as spiritual or religious references to those species, so that a congregant can hold that booklet in his or her hand and get an appreciation of the commonality of knowledge and understanding that comes to the species that are protected within their sacred ground. And my hope was that they would see that the trees in their churchyard, not only are they sacred, but maybe the trees just across the street from their churchyard, those might also share some sacred characteristics that are worthy of protection. And maybe the trees up in the hills above the church might also share those characteristics. So this effort to sort of spread what is already considered sacred outside of the churchyard was very important to us. This led to some really wonderful collaborations, some real conservation activities. I was invited to tree plantings of churches that they had already organized, to celebrate and protect the creation of God. And that sort of signaled to me the commonality. I mean, I believe that trees and different species have been, are a product of evolution. Some of the religious people believe that they're a product of the creation of God. But what we have in common is that we want to protect these creations of evolution or creations of God, and we can do that together. My next step was then to kind of move to a slightly higher level, and I've been working with different theological seminaries. Seminaries are places where priests and ministers are trained, and so they have a much more far-reaching footstep, I guess, than just a single scientist going into a single church. So for example, I've given some talks at the Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. I realized that the seminary itself actually protects a large chunk of land, as many seminaries do, on which trees and plants grow, which birds visit, which microorganisms inhabit in the soil. And so I proposed to them a number of projects that their seminarians might get involved with, drawing upon this idea that trees are diverse, that Genesis tells us that God made the wild animals, the tame animals, and all the small crawling creatures. And so they might be interested in documenting and monitoring the health of the plants, the trees in particular, that grow on their seminarian grounds. And I linked them up with creating a BioBlitz for their seminary grounds to tally the biodiversity of the species. Trees also signal to us elements of time. We know that to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven, as Ecclesiastes tells us. And so I involved them with a citizen science project called Project Budburst, which monitors the seasonality or phenology of leaf burst, flower burst, fruiting, and leaf fall, that they can contribute to a scientific project that monitors these different phenomena. I also want to just sort of signal that this approach of bringing science to seminaries is much larger than myself. The AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has a wonderful program called the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DOSER. They facilitate dialogue between scientists and the religious communities. They give workshops around the country. They have a Science and Seminarians project where they support conferences, like for instance at the Wartburg Theological Seminary in Iowa that I gave a talk to last week. And if you're interested in that, just please Google them, because I think it's a really high quality program. Another approach at a slightly larger scale is to try to bring together scientists in a scientific society level with local religious groups. So for example, the Ecological Society of America is my home professional society. It has about 7,000 members of ecologists from around the world. They have their meetings, their annual meetings in different cities. And almost always these meetings are stuck in these convention centers where the scientists just sit there and stay there and eat there and interact with each other. Whereas there are faith-based communities and other community groups that are active all around in the city. And so I decided that it would be a good idea to maybe link ecologists who come to our meeting in Salt Lake City, which is programmed for this summer, with the dominant religious group here in Utah, which is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so I've made arrangements with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir to have a special performance where they will sing songs about nature and the earth. Ecologists from the meeting are invited to that session. And so Mormons and ecologists then will have this time of common experience of listening to this wonderful group of singers who will be celebrating exactly what ecologists do, which is the diversity and ecosystem services of the earth. Interesting, the Mormon Conference Center, which is downtown, has the largest green roof installation of any other building in Salt Lake City. And so we've also arranged for ecologists to visit this as a field trip to demonstrate that the members of this church are interested in sustainability, they're interested in native plants, and that ecologists might learn from them as to how to navigate the creation of a green roof in a large urban center. The last thing I'll just mention is something that has come up fairly recently, and I would really love input in terms of how we might navigate the question of religious members of an audience listening to lectures that are primarily scientific in their orientation. This is a part of our prison project, our Science in Prison project. We've partnered with NASA to provide NASA scientists to go into correctional institutions to talk about the topic of astrobiology, which is about the origin and the creation of life in the universe. And so this we present as essentially the scientific story of creation, but we present it in these correctional institutions. We went to 16 institutions last year, and we had surveys, pre and post lecture surveys, to try to understand how much science knowledge content had been passed on, the self-identity of the inmates as science learners, their desire to learn more science about this topic. You can see in one of the slides there that our NASA scientist is talking in the chapel, actually, of the correctional institution in Florida. It's a state prison, and painted on the walls of that is an image of the Last Supper. So we were presenting this sort of astrobiology science story right literally in the shadows of the religious story of creation and background. I'll just show you a little bit of data just to show you what we tried to sort of pull out was, our question was whether those who responded in the surveys with some sort of religious question, they use the word God or creation or Jesus, that indicated that they had a religious background. And we compared that to survey responses that did not have any of these religious terms. What we found was that in every case, both for non-religious, the NR, versus the religious, just R, that there was an increase in knowledge content, in their shifting of science activity, identity, their value of science, and their future actions about gaining more information about science. So our conclusion with this very preliminary sort of survey results was that those who do hold religious convictions, as indicated by their responses, can gain from scientifically these presentations. So kind of in summary then, I think that when we try to answer this very important question for all human beings, how do we understand and communicate in a world that's experiencing increasing disturbances, that it's not only the scientific or the religious approach that helps us to answer this question, but I really think it's the interweaving of these that comes from, at least for the moment, suspending our own beliefs and values. That is, for me to put aside the scientific authorities and to embrace the religious authorities in order to find this common ground that we might share to better care for, in my case, trees and the earth, but I think we might extend this to other topics as well. And so with that, I'm happy to hear the other questions that Jory has ready for us and to answer any questions about these activities.
Wonderful. Well, as always, Nalini, I'm blown away by the work that you're doing. It's such cool work. And now you can all see why I was inspired to think about having a session on this at the summit. So what I want to do now is, I know that's a lot to respond to, but I'm going to put you on the spot, Amy, Laura, and Andrew, and ask you to respond your thoughts on, from your perspectives as people who are quite familiar with communities of faith, what do you see in Nalini's work that's full? And let's start with you, Andrew, and then we'll get to Amy, Laura.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nalini. Your work is just incredible. Thank you for the work that you do. One thing that I just have to say off the top that I loved was that seeing histograms of religious references, even hearing an ecological ethnography of a church, that there's music here and there's people wear nice clothes and sermons last 50 minutes. You were like mapping a rhizome in a really delightful way. And what I loved about that was that it is illustrative of a really good strategy, I think, for engaging between thought communities, which is that it sounds like Nalini really went into these spaces. I think the language that she used was recognizing that there are kind of multiple authorities, intellectual authorities, paradigms, domains of knowledge that are interfacing there. I think that it's admirable to be able to find intellectual allies by setting aside for maybe a moment one's kind of bracketing one's larger worldview to think about where are the specific intellectual spaces where we can interact. That takes a lot of humility and intellectual flexibility to be able to interact in that way. So that's one thing that I guess some thoughts that come to mind.
Great, thanks.
Can I just respond to that quickly, Jory?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
That concept of intellectual humility is something that I've just learned about recently. Actually, Mark Leary at Duke University is someone who's written about this. He's a philosopher and psychologist. And it's all about this concept of setting aside for the moment or for a short time one's own paradigm of how the world works or how it can be explained, and having literally the humility to say, I'm going to set that aside in order to let this in. It doesn't mean you're giving it up. It doesn't mean you're turning into a Baptist because you read the Baptist Bible. You can still retain your own intellectual identity, but it means that for the moment you set it aside in order to make space for you to make space to make that common ground apparent.
So intellectual humility is not an oxymoron, is what you're saying.
That's right. Well, that's what we scientists definitely have to learn. Yeah. And maybe religious people have to learn that too. But it's a beautiful concept, I think, that can help, I think can help science communicators do a better job than simply insisting my intellectual approach is better than yours and saying, let me put that aside for the moment.
Another word that just comes to mind, if I may, is we have a concept in religious studies called methodological agnosticism. That no matter what my particular beliefs, if I'm going into an ethnographic study of a particular religious group, I'm going to bracket my own worldview, enter into an agnostic space where I'm trying to hold back judgment or all-encompassing absolute theories of the world so as to be more receptive. So yeah, it's something that in religious studies we have to get trained in early, because we want to preserve our sense of self as well.
Yes.
Great. Amy Laura, I want to give you a chance to jump in here with your thoughts. And you are muted. Let's get you unmuted. I'm trying to unmute. There you go. Yep. Work? Yep.
Okay. Good. So yeah, lots. I'm thinking about a lot of different things at the same time. Let me say what I'm really grateful for. I am really grateful for the specificity, the focus on trees in particular texts and particular communities. In my experience now, in my field has been so shaped by one foundation, one funding foundation. It have created this whole apparatus called religion and science. And very often the projects that are funded are try to attempt a kind of moral Esperanto, some sort of way of a language that will serve everybody, like all human beings, which I think is a problematic endeavor. And I can talk a little bit more about what I find problematic about those endeavors, but I'll say just up front that the specificity, the fact that you are thinking specifically about trees as a scholar, scientist, researcher, activist who knows trees, and that you're going into particular communities and thinking about particular sacred texts in those specific communities, I think is a real gift, And can I say one thing in terms of just to make sure? So one of the questions you asked, Jory, early on was how to engage particular communities of faith, particular groups of people who profess a particular belief system. And it's very hard for me to even talk about this without, I feel like I'm eliding differences between religions, and I'm not comfortable doing that. But as I've been thinking about it, at least I'll just specifically talk about, say a few things about like a Methodist church. So if you went into a Methodist church, once we're able to actually be inside a church again, if you went in, you would find that there would be science teachers in the congregation who are teaching science to elementary school kids. You'll have if it's in a university town, you might have some people who are working at the research university. You'll have people who are working for the pharmaceutical industry. You'll have people who are trained in a form of the sciences who can you have people who can participate and teach one another. So that's what I've been thinking most about since we started talking about this, is how to encourage people who are in congregations, and I'll just use that word. I've been thinking about this in terms of Protestant congregations, but also it would work for Catholic congregations also. How to encourage people not to think that they can't teach in a church because they're not being invited to give a TED talk. Because that is how a lot of congregations are functioning right now, is unless you are trained to give a talk, unless you are trained to give a talk in 5 minutes and tell a whole bunch of things in whatever, people do not necessarily realize that they have the capacity to sit down with other members of their congregation, young people, old people, and teach in that congregation. So that's what I've been most thinking about in terms of constructive proposals.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, so I want to, Nalini's work is fantastic, and we all love hearing her talk about it. But I'm wondering, do any of the three of you know of other similar work, other examples where people are successfully engaging communities of faith in science or STEM outreach? I would imagine there's at least a few other people who are trying to do this. So I open it up to any of the three of you if you know of other work.
I'll just say again, sort of a shout out to the Dozer group at AAAS, that they have workshops where they're training scientists actively to engage in different ways with faith-based groups. I also want to mention an ecologist named Greg Hitzhusen at Ohio State University. He's been very involved with the Interfaith Power and Light, which is about bringing information about climate change to faith-based groups. And he's actually teaching a course in the environmental and natural history or natural resources department at OSU about the environment and faith-based and religious groups. So there are definitely people who are involved with this, both from the religious side as well as the scientific side.
I'm not even going to try to guess how to spell that name, but Nalini, would you be willing to type it into chat for us? I think there was also a question earlier from someone, and maybe you could put this in chat. Was it Andrew Leary at Duke? Was that the name? Mark Leary. So if you could type that into chat, because someone wanted to know about that. And Dozer, correct me if I'm wrong, AAAS's project is it the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion? Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Okay. And I think there's some AAAS people.
Rob O'Malley is on the call right now. He's the main guy right there that I've interacted with. So Rob O'Malley is a great communicator, great scientist himself, and I think he'd be very open to questions and letting people know about opportunities.
Great. So during coffee chats or whatever. So Amy Laura, I think you were going to add something as well. Do you want to unmute and let us know what you were going to add?
I was going to say that one of the efforts that I've been a part of is the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which is an interfaith. You can look up, if you look up National Religious Campaign Against Torture, it's an interfaith effort to bring awareness about US sponsored torture across the world. And the efforts are very congregational based in terms of going into congregations and talking about torture. And of course, it involves science. Y'all know this. I don't have to go into detail. I mean, it was there were scientists involved in creating the technologies of torture, and there are scientists now also involved in trying to resist and draw attention to U.S.-sponsored torture here and abroad, including solitary confinement in incarcerated communities.
Great.
That was a euphemism, including solitary confinement, incarcerated communities. Anyway.
So, Andrew, were there any that you wanted to add that you know of?
I think one thing I would just underscore is that I think there's a really interesting thing going on in religion and science, which is that Nalini and Amy Laura have mentioned, which is that so often religion and science can get focused on really big abstract debates about beginnings of life, about age of the earth. And that's, in our experience, especially working at the National Museum of American History, that's often where we start to lose people. I did a lot of audience surveys with folks where we would say, we might do an exhibit on religion and science. Would this be interesting to you? And over people said, no, that's controversial, that's not for me. And then we would say, well, we've got some really cool objects. I've got this God helmet that's supposed to give you religious experiences, and I've got, these old texts, the Jefferson Bible. And then they would say, oh, that is for me, that is really interesting. And I think that citizen science and other projects that ground community interactions, like Nalini's work and some of Amy Laura Hall's work as well, are a great example of how we can get past some of that conflict-oriented kind of ideology that can initially make us feel intellectually distant, and actually cooperate on some concrete projects together.
Wonderful, thank you. I will just add, I put this in the chat box, but there's a project I'm familiar with called the Clergy Letter Project. Some of you might be familiar with this. And this is a project where religious institutions sign on essentially to a letter that says that faith and religion are not contradictory to biological evolution. And so it's sort of getting at this whole issue with creationism, intelligent design, evolution, and all of that. So I think there's a lot of people out there that are starting to do this, but I think if you take a step back, it's still a relatively rare area for people to focus on in terms of STEM outreach. I think, STEM outreach to other communities such as K-12 communities or racial and ethnic groups that are underrepresented in STEM still tend to be sort of more popular outlets for broader impacts efforts. So for any of you, I'll open up to any of you, why do you think it is that historically people have been so hesitant to try to engage people in faith communities with science, as a form of broader impacts, or just because they thought it was worth doing? Well, Amy Laura, you're muted.
Can you ask the question again? I'm trying to understand what is most at stake in your question.
Yeah, so I was making the observation that despite the work of Nalini and a few other people who are starting to do this, efforts to engage faith communities in science is still relatively rare compared to other types of STEM outreach efforts. So most people who do STEM outreach as their broader impacts work tend to go into after-school programs or summer science camps or K-12 settings. Relatively few choose to do this with communities of faith, and I'm just wondering why you think that is.
I think I'm really, what Andrew said was that people have this dichotomy, have a sense that science and religion are antithetical, that if you believe in God, you can't believe in science. I think the separation of church and state in our country, that, oh, well, we can't talk about God in schools because that's just not supposed to happen. And I think that, there are many scientists who are people of faith. And I think some of those people who can hold both the religious context and the scientific context in their own mind and spirit are really great examples of the fact that this is not necessarily true. So I think we have to simply do this, speaking as a scientist and on behalf of other scientists, is that keep in mind that congregants themselves, from what I found so far, are not necessarily antithetical, that as long as you approach them with this intellectual humility that we were talking about. And I think another piece of this, and we haven't mentioned this before, is that we scientists can invite religious people to our venues. I mean, there's seminar series where the public is allowed to come in. I mean, I can invite people from a church to say, hey, there's going to be a talk about evolution, or there's going to be a talk about conservation biology that you might be interested in, or there's a talk about trees that you might be interested in. So I think that this flow of ideas, this flow of people, this flow of exchange can go in both directions, but we have to kind of shake ourselves up to think about, like, oh, really, would I invite a congregation from my local Catholic church to come to an academic seminar? Well, yeah, why not? Why not? Yeah.
Amy Laura, did you want to add something?
I think part of why I'm struggling with the question, Jory, is because I haven't experienced this radical conflict between people who are attending Duke Divinity School and scientists. I haven't experienced that. So it's part of what's confusing to me is I think part of what's going on is that the stories that hit the media, the stories that end up being picked up and retold again and again, are the sensationalist stories about Christians who have, I guess, some amount of cultural power, who are opposing teaching evolution in schools or something. But those are sensationalist stories, and they are they get blown up and out of proportion in terms of what's actually happening. So, you know, people may know something about the man who owns Hobby Lobby, but he's an outlier. And so I haven't experienced those conflicts. Now, I could talk about ways that some conflicts I have seen, but I have not seen those conflicts in terms of at least Catholic and Protestant congregations in the United States. And that would include Pentecostal denominations, because I do have students who come from Pentecostal and charismatic congregations, and I haven't experienced conflict. I'll stop there, but I know there are stories, and I know that there are some conflicts, but I think they're blown out of proportion in the media.
So thank you for that. And I think, especially in light of what you just said, that really gets back to my question, which is, why is it the case, especially if there aren't as many conflicts as you might think, why then has the science community not historically made more of an effort to reach out to communities of faith? And I'll open it up to anyone. Andrew, I see your head nodding. Do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think it's just such a good question. Reminds me, there was a Pew survey a few years ago that found that 60% of Americans said that religion and science are fundamentally in conflict, but something like 70% said, I personally have no problem integrating both of those together. When asked, like, do they conflict for you? And so our perception is that they are more in conflict than they are, and that if that's going to consistently lead scientists and people doing broader impact work to just expect disinterest, then I would imagine that in some ways that means that cultural misnomer creates a lot of opportunity, because this would be such an unexplored type of intersection point.
Yeah, I think that's a really great message for people doing BI and everybody here at this conference. It's funny, when I meant to mention that one of the things that I and my colleagues have been doing in the last few years has been to set up what we call the STEM Ambassador Program. It's an NSF-funded training and research project to guide scientists to carry out engagement events with what we originally started calling science unengaged publics. Science unengaged publics. That was in the first line of our proposal. And we were going to do this work where we would go to focal groups and public groups that are not engaged with science. And we set up a process where we got sort of figured out how to connect scientists with a focal group, to do immersion visits, we introduced design thinking, and to come up with creative ways of engagement. We had reflection and evaluation. And at the end of 2 years, we realized that we actually we did not encounter with any of our ambassadors a science unengaged public. And we were going into prisons, we were going into cooking classes, we were going into churches, we were going into, what seemed to be very distant audiences. But what we found was that, in fact, people in these groups are not science unengaged. I think this links up with what Amy Laura is saying, is that these ideas that we scientists have of, they're going to reject science, they're going to be negatively inclined to listen or to engage with a scientist. We just haven't yet, after 4 years, we just haven't come up with that. And, it may be that we're missing some groups that are science engaged, but we can still say that we still need to have scientists go into these venues, because there definitely are people who do not feel welcome in museums. Very often people who don't have the financial ability or haven't been brought up with that cultural, hey, let's go to the museum on Sunday morning. So there's still a need for BI and for public engagement in these venues and with these groups. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those groups, when encountered in a safe, trusting way by scientists who are open and have gone through some process of intellectual humility, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be receptive and in fact help scientists understand that piece of the world better than the scientists might have.
I just think, can I say something on that?
Yes, please.
I was just thinking that the Museum of Life and Science, which I think, Susan, did you mention that at the beginning? When, yeah.
We were supposed to go there.
Yeah, the Museum of Life and Science in Durham is so much more diverse, racially, economically. It's so much more diverse than my church. It's so much more diverse than if you know, any given afternoon at the Museum of Life and Science, you're gonna have children talking to one another across all sorts of different cultural divides, and adults trying to think through how to talk about what the kids are seeing and running through. And those are the sorts of contexts where you can see people across many different divides coming together to learn about science. I'm so grateful for the funding that makes that possible.
Wonderful. I want to ask a question. There's been lots of great conversation in the chat room and lots of great questions submitted. I want to ask one that came from Nancy Holmes, University of Idaho. Hi, Nancy. And I'm going to paraphrase her question, but essentially what she's saying is that these kind of efforts going into houses, religious houses, communities of faith, and reaching out to people are great, but that sometimes there are communities or subsets of communities, religious communities that don't attend these things or don't participate, that these non-participants are the ones that are more difficult to reach and interface with for STEM outreach. And so she just wanted thoughts from any of you on how do you reach the people who maybe aren't as receptive, aren't going to the church or to the talk at a church with an open mind, but rather are a little bit more cut off from the efforts that people like Nalini are making.
Is the question specifically about people who profess a particular faith but aren't attending, are not regularly a part of a group?
So the way she worded it, I maybe did a poor job of paraphrasing. In her work with interfaith groups, she's found that some religious communities do not typically participate in these interface groups. These non-participants are the ones that are more difficult to reach and interface with. So I think people who identify as religious, but of activities that Nalini is engaging in, are there other ways to reach them, perhaps?
Well, I mean, museums, the public school system, like, please, more funding for everything. Let's throw as much money as we can towards public schools. Yeah. I guess those would be the kinds of locations where I would think it'd be good to interact. And let me say, I want to say one more thing about where there is conflict. From my perspective, where there is conflict is within ways of describing the world that count groups of people or individuals as dross in evolutionary progress. So, I mean, and scientists know it's not even scientifically accurate, but that way of thinking about human beings and human history, I think, is in conflict with Christianity. And I just wanted to name that. So there's a form of social Darwinism that I think is in conflict. And the reason that I'm making this connection is because the sense that public school funding is a waste because it's, you know, wasting money on children who are lost anyway, or all the different arguments that you hear for not putting more money into public schools are often set within a kind of social Darwinism. So that's one place where I will name that I think there is conflict that I hope people in, y'all keep saying the term scientific community, so I'll risk saying that term, scientific community, will help resist those forms of arguments against social spending. And we're seeing it all over right now. I mean, yeah. We said we weren't going to talk too much about the virus, but yeah.
Okay, Nalini, do you have any thoughts based on someone who's been doing this work on how, you know, are there pockets of the communities of faith that you're missing through the work you're doing? And have you thought about this challenge and how to address it?
Yeah, I just want to make clear that, the work that I've done have been not necessarily, I mean, I mentioned Unitarian churches, which are sort of interfaith in many ways, but we've also done this work in very much denominational settings. A Catholic church, a Presbyterian church. I mean, the Wartburg Seminary is an evangelical Lutheran Church of America. They're very, very much along the lines of, we have this set of beliefs and this is who we are. So I think that it is possible, again, to use this intellectual humility to get into those groups. I think what we need to do is actually more on the almost anthropological or even marketing line, which is, if they're not coming to church, if this group of people that was mentioned in the question, if they're not coming to church, then where are they getting their information? Are they reading certain magazines? Are they going to certain blogs? Are they belonging to certain meetup groups where, again, there's the possibility for scientists to intercept with them? So what we have to do is to be, again, more humble about saying, well, maybe it's not this venue where I think everybody congregates, but where is it that they're getting, where is it that they might be presenting an opportunity to communicate? And that, again, takes work on from our standpoint to find out, where are they? What are they reading? What are they listening to? And you might have to do an immersion visit to Fox News or to someplace that you're not ordinarily yourself going to go to in order to find out what is being talked about there and how is it being discussed, and how, as a scientist, might I get access to that? So right now I'm working with some seminarians, for example, to figure out, where do I publish this sermon that I put together on trees and spirituality? What journals do seminarians read where they might pick up on this and actually present it to their congregants? And it's not the journal Ecology, and it's not Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, I can tell you that. But I mean, maybe they do read that, but where they might go to primarily get their information might be a very, very different journal. And I have to learn how to find out who the editor is and what the format is of submitting an article. And so that is work that I would have to do as a scientist, very often in collaboration with like the head of the seminary to help guide me. And I think that's where these interactions can help us scientists to move into those areas, is to find partners that can help us do that.
Wonderful. So we are at 12:30 East Coast time right now. I begged Susan for a few extra minutes because this conversation is so interesting and fascinating, and I don't ever want it to end. It's going to have to end in a few minutes. But Andrew, I want to give you the last word on this previous question, because you're doing this work with the Smithsonian, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on how to reach people that we might not be reaching currently.
Thank you. Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with Nalini's point about trying over and over again. The comedian in me, if I knew that there were people not coming to a comedy show that I was doing, but I really wanted them there, that the way to get them there is going to be to keep working on the material, keep doing more performances, and getting closer and closer. And I think that finding our audience does, as Nalini points out, involve making allies, finding people who are going to be those local experts who can help provide some cultural literacy. To Amy Laura's point, about social Darwinism and some of the ways that perhaps two people interacting with very different intellectual backgrounds might have conflict, I think that that's also something that requires being comfortable with. My in-laws are of a very different worldview than me, and we're 10 years in now, and I'm finally getting better at realizing how to navigate certain conversations. I think a lot of us have those experiences in our lives, and it's a lot of the same skills of figuring out where the other person is, not knowing that we're not going to be able to leave and completely enter into their headspace, but that maybe we can meet them halfway. I don't know, maybe that's a little bit empty, but I think that making the effort does lead to surprising results.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's great. Thank you. Amy, Laura, or Nalini, any sort of final thoughts from either of you on that?
Yeah, I was thinking of the conflict more in terms of large foundations and what questions they're funding. And I wasn't thinking so much interpersonally, but I hear you interpersonally on that point. And in teaching, yeah, I understand the importance of that. But I was thinking more in terms of large institutions and the messaging of social Darwinism that goes on. That was passive voice on purpose, I guess.
Great. Nalini, any final thoughts from you? Because we have to wrap up.
Right. I'll just say, especially to the BI professionals, the science communicators who are doing trainings of scientists at their universities or wherever, to encourage their scientists or their communicators, their graduate students, the faculty who come by their offices, who want to know about what can my broader impacts be for my next NSF grant, is to be unafraid, to be encouraged, to know there are some resources and precedents now to engage with faith-based groups. And it doesn't have to be big scale. It doesn't even have to be as big as your neighborhood church. It could be your neighbor, and you have a conversation. I have conversations with my next door neighbor who's a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he's one of the people who helped me get into the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. He got it that I wanted to bring ecologists and his faith together. So I think starting as small as one person to one person can lead to other things that will have more impact and significance in the future. So I just really encourage people to move forward with that, with faith that something really positive can come out of this.
Wonderful. Well, this has been such a fascinating conversation. It was everything I hoped for and more. I wish it could go on, but we do need to wrap up. It's been really inspiring. You all three of you, thank you so much for your contributions and for the fascinating dialogue. There was also a lot of great conversation. I was trying to follow it in the chat room. There were so many great questions and I didn't have a chance to get to most of them. I apologize for that, but there will be coffee breaks and virtual coffee breaks and opportunities to have these conversations further. But with that, I want to thank our panelists once again and thank all of you for attending, and then I'll hand it now back to Andy.
Lovely, thank you very much. I think probably in a Zoom world, applauding is picking up David's idea of jazz handing. So if our panelists can see everyone else on their Brady Bunch